Okay, it's Chris again. So most of you watching this this YouTube video, you can actually produce videos yourself using your smartphone. But if you're also watching this because, like me, you're interested in photography, then you probably have a DSLR camera or a mirrorless camera or something along those lines. So why do I use a DSLR for vlogging? Alright, the reason that I use a DSLR for doing these YouTube vlogs is because I'm able to set this at 24 frames per second. That is a good choice to use when doing videos. Most or many films that are produced are done at 24 frames per second. That's really to say the equivalent of 24 still images per second. Now, in PowerDirector, the editing software that I use, I also set that in the settings to 24 frames per second. I think that is actually a default setting for PowerDirector. So that is the one of choice. If you're doing other types of video, like if you were showing fast-moving cars or any fast action shots, then you could set it at maybe 60 frames per second, and then in editing slow it down, create slow motion. But normally 24 frames per second is fantastic. Now, in order to film at 24 frames per second, what you should do is, when you're setting a DSLR on the movie settings, you need to have a shutter speed. You work out the shutter speed, that being 24 frames per second, so double that, which would be 1/48. Now you can't actually get 1/48, it's 1/50, which is the nearest equivalent. And the reason then that I use a 35mm lens for doing this type of project is because I can set it at those fast shutter speeds. I can do that because I can get a wide open aperture. Now the aperture, the way of describing that is with the F numbers. The largest sort of aperture you can get with something like a 35mm lens is 1.4. Now that is to say 1.4, that would be a diameter of 25mm. 35 divided by 1.4 is equal to 25mm. Now the area, if it's almost a circle, the diaphragms within the lens, depends how many blades there are, but it forms a circle, and you can calculate that out by the diameter, squaring it, dividing it by 4 and multiplying it by pi. And then that comes to 491 millimeters squared. That's after it's rounded off. Now, when you go up to from 1.4 to 2, that's actually halving the area. You can see that in the calculation just here. No. Okay, the calculations, the rest of the calculations are shown on the sheet, and you can see that with each f-stop, the area of light being let in is half, approximately half. It's rounded up or down. So, if I was to use, I could use, for example, an 18 to 55mm zoom lens, or an 18 to 105mm zoom lens. The disadvantage of that would be the lowest f-stop I can get is probably 5.6 or 4. If it was as good as 4, then that would be an area of 60mm squared, which means that in order to get sufficient light coming in, you have to bump the ISO up, or you have, in order to get a suitable shutter speed, don't forget the shutter speed. In this case, we want it to be 2 times 24 frames per second as a reciprocal of 1. So that's 1 over 2 times 24. So rounded up to 1 over 50. Now the other reason that I use the 35mm lens, so we've talked about those properties. It lets more light in so you can get a faster shutter speed. That can be also a disadvantage, because when it lets in lots of light, then it's hard to get a slow shutter speed, or it's harder. Sometimes you want to get a slow shutter speed if you want to create movement blur, for example. I'll talk more about that next week. But generally, the 35mm lens, I find, is good for doing landscape. It's good for doing portraits, as long as it's not too close up, because there can be some slight distortion. It's good for doing close up of plants, if you want to throw the background into blur. And in fact, for zoom, you use your legs. You move either nearer to the subject or further away. If I was to use, for this vlog, if I was to use a fixed millimeter 85mm lens, which is, now that lens is good for doing portraits, but then it would have to be further away from me. It would seem too distant. So really, 35mm, it approximates to what you can see, the field of vision of your eye. And the low f-stop, this one actually is not the best 35mm lens. I would have to pay more for that. But with this I can get an f-stop of 1.8, which is pretty good really. Okay, so I think that's it covered for today. Next week I'm going to talk about the relationship between f-stop, so that's the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO. Those are the 3 pillars for creating the types of photographs that you want. So either everything sharp, or subject sharp and the background blur, or for getting movement blur. You can play with those settings to get the sort of effect that you want. It's always a trade-off if you between those settings, but often you can use them creatively to get the effect that you want. So that will be on the next week, Friday the 13th of October. Okay, that's it for this week. If you like this video, do the thumbs up, subscribe, and then you'll get information, notifications on further videos. I'm normally going to be doing these every Friday. If there's any topic that someone wants me to talk about specifically regarding photography or creating vlogs, let me know. Okay, thanks, bye.